Talking about shame, Washington Justice.
They had an 8-20 record last year, 39-72 six-map record. Started the season 2-18. Stage 4, they went 6-1 with the only loss to Atlanta. They defeated Toronto, Florida, Vancouver, Boston, Houston, and Paris.
That Stage 4 was crazy.
Stage 4 was...
Like I'm saying, it's a shame they couldn't have been doing that all season.
Yeah,
Stage 4 was a peak for these guys.
The Stage 4 thing, which, one, it brought up some of the stupidest opinions I've ever heard from teams where they're like, why isn't Washington in the playoffs? It's like, because they were
literal hot
straight
garbage.
Trash the first 3 stages. 2 wins in the entire season up until then. It's like, you don't deserve to be in the playoffs when you sucked it up that bad. And
there was no way that they could turn it around to get a winning record to get into the playoffs.
Yeah, because they were like, so bad.
They were out the first week of Stage 4. Like, they had no chances of getting even into the play-ins.
Yeah, and I think last season felt like a season of excuses.
Right.
When I think of Washington, you sign Wizard Young, and that already is like, all right.
Cool.
They blew up expectations before season of like, oh, we have this great coach, blah, blah, blah. And then they suck it up so bad that there's backlash. There's genuine backlash towards Wizard Young as a coach because he's apparently a genius coach, but he can't lead this roster.
Is there backlash, Xavier?
Yeah. This podcast started as a Wizard Young hate podcast, essentially. And then as the season went on, you just hear all these things of like, oh, we didn't expect GOATs to go on so long. We built our roster for 2-2-2. And I do believe, all right, yeah, you kind of did build your roster for 2-2-2 if 2-2-2 comes in and you're a monster.
Right.
But I feel like...
You have to adapt.
Yeah, there's an issue with roster construction where you can't adapt to what's given to you because those first 3 stages, Corey marginally improved on Zarya. Giannis was still bad. Sam was awful.
Yeah.
Their support line was just all over the place. Arc was okay. Sleepy was okay. Gita was okay. And it felt like this team just had nothing going for them. And then in Stage 4, it honestly just felt it was Corey and Stratus going supernova.
Yeah.
And that kind of pushing them past some of these teams.
Yeah, and to bounce off you talking about the Stage 4, like, we were building it for the 2-2-2 meta, it feels like because there was such a shift in, like, the third stage where everybody was all like, well, we're going to 2-2-2. It's going to be locked in. You're going to have to play this way. And then it being, like, presented as, like, something where all these teams that basically seem to just, like, wind their way into getting a way to actually make some wins. And it's, like, not saying Washington in general, but it seemed like teams like London, New York, Boston, Paris, all these teams were like, well, we made our team for 2-2-2, even though Paris said they were a GOATs team. We made our teams for 2-2-2. It's not fair that, like, we keep getting stomped on by Vancouver and Shock.
Right.
And likewise the Gladiators, but not as hard. But it just came off that, like, the only reason why the entire game shifted to being like, it's locked 2-2-2, that is the meta now, is because, like, not just, like, casual players were complaining about getting stuck going up against this, like, GOATs thing, but it was also just, well, this forces this rigid structure where it's like, now you gotta find the meta with only 2 tanks. Figure out who the best 2 tanks are in this patch. Figure out who the best 2 DPS are. Figure out who the best 2 support are. And if a coach is not going to, like Wizard Young, who was apparently a genius coach, couldn't work before that. And it's a ridiculous claim.
And here's the thing. I think with GOATs, the biggest thing I take away from GOATs is that the best team typically won. There were upsets, but I feel like in GOATs, it was in a way where the teams were limited in their ability to just completely have one dude carry.
Right.
I mean, we see that with Florida. Florida Stage 4, Sia player and Gargoyle lose their minds, and even with Washington, Corey had some games where he was just a hard carry, and that pushed them past certain things. And in Stage 3, LA Valiant didn't really find their footing until GOATs loosened up a little bit, and it allowed a little bit more of a carry situation. But with Washington, yet again, in GOATS, they didn't have the skill set for GOATS. I don't think that they had the coaching to teach them GOATS. And I felt like they just kind of ended up punting until 2-2-2 came, which I think
was a mistake.
Yeah, it's a mistake because I feel like you want to put your best foot forward going into the season. However, Stage 4 is proof that this team is stupidly talented. We go 6-1, and obviously beating Toronto, Florida, and Boston aren't anything, but destroying Vancouver is something.
Yes.
Destroying Houston was something in Stage 4, and I think beating Paris is a solid win. You know, just looking at who Paris is as a team.
And on paper, before Washington became such a massive wreck, I personally thought Paris and Washington were evenly matched with talent. Going further and further into the season, I thought these two teams should be solid rivals, talent-wise.
And so they made a lot of changes in the offseason. Cut Wizard Young, obviously. Signed John Galt, I think that's his name. Homie was with the Gladiators for a little bit. This is their coach. They cut Fazix, they cut Sleepy, R.I.P. They cut Adu, they cut Yanis, they cut Guido, they cut Hayuno, they cut Sansam. That's a lot of cuts, and they basically retained, I don't know, they're dope players.
Yeah.
Keep Corey, Stratus, and do you really need more? They signed Lolish and Elivote, but they were on the team before. Just visa issues held them up. But, next year is their rookie year. They signed Aim God, who I think is a upgrade over Guido and Sleepy. They signed Roar, who is an obvious upgrade in the tank slot. And they signed Tuba, who I have no idea about, but I love his name.
I do too. It's a fun name.
Tuba with 2 T's. I like it.
Yeah.
Tuba, I think their team has some fun names in general, especially the people who they signed. That's Nathan's dream weird name team coming to life.
Yeah.
Minus McGravy.
Take it back to day 1 of the Scrapyard, and you'll get that shit.
Yeah,
No, it's not. Dude, it's not pronounced tuba. It's pronounced tuba. Stop pronouncing the first T and not the second one.
Oh, my bad.
So, I think there is something interesting with kind of this roster construction. I think Washington's going to definitely be better this year. I see them winning definitely more than 8 games, but I don't see them winning more than 16. So somewhere close around 14, 13. Similar to Boston, I think I still have reservations about this coaching thing. I feel like, Stage 4 was good, but I think if we elongated Stage 4 out into maybe 7 more games, so if it was 14 more games left in the season, I see Washington's deficiencies slowly starting to creep up that we saw in GOATS. Just some of the weird stuff with positioning, some of the lack of communication, lack of clutch ability within GOATS. And I think those would rear their head over a larger sample size. So there is a real big issue with sample size for me when it comes to the Washington Justice. But there's also, having the best player in the game at a given moment. And Corey, more often than not, will be the best player in the game. You put them up against a lot of teams, especially if this does end up being a sniper comp, and even his Reaper's not too bad. But Corey will be the best player in the game in most given circumstances, and sometimes you just got to go with the team with the best player, playing right now.
Individual talent.
Yes, and they have some individual talent. Aim God is a very talented player. Roar is a talented player. Lolish and Elivo, I have no idea about them, but they've been riding together for a while, like the tank version of Shaz and Big Goose. So that works. But then there's Corey, and I believe here's the hottest of takes that I genuinely believe. Corey is my pick for MVP next year. I think Corey is going to win the Most Valuable Player award and be the third person next to Jonak and Sinatra. I think he's going to be the third.
That's a really good take.
Because you look at MVP, and it's not just about who the best player is. If it was the best player, Prophet would win every year. Shout out. No, but MVP is also just about, I believe, narrative. I think Jonak had a narrative of, I think back then people just kind of coming into Overwatch League looked at Jonak and was like, oh, he's a support. But he's
Right.
also taking these wild flanks, bloodthirsty. He was on the best team in the league, and that mattered. And same with Sinatra. I think, obviously, Sinatra was the best Doomfist, but it's not like Sinatra was unanimously the far and away pick for MVP last year. You know, a lot of people were saying Haxel should be MVP.
Yeah.
Twilight should be MVP. Janu, that wasn't the strongest argument, but I heard, you know, people were very convinced of Janu, but Twilight and Haxel were two people a lot of people in the league were saying, damn, they should be MVP.
Right.
But Sinatra had the narrative behind him, too. Golden Stage, just even his history as a player in Season 1, becoming so improved in Season 2, just the sheer dominance of his team, and his dominance on Zarya and then on Doomfist, I think those outweighed maybe the insane stats that Twilight put up, because Twilight didn't have the storyline behind him.
Right.
And this is where it leads me to Corey, where one, Corey is the best player on this team. This team is basically going to play around him. And if we saw on Stage 4, Corey is a magnificent player. Highlights every single game. Going into the World Cup, it's a very similar trajectory to Sinatra. Going into the World Cup, Corey amazed people. And everybody, even Sinatra himself said Corey should have won World Cup MVP. Corey was that good in the World Cup. He leveled up 3 levels. He was insane.
Corey pushed his time not being around, like, the other dudes in the Washington Justice. He even, in the, like, little contenders thing that happened in Australia when they were down there, he was out of his mind even then, and that was him going into the world. Like, that was him basically scrimming to get it, like, with the World Cup. So him just showing how passionate he is and how, like, hard he is at going in for his, like, his goals, it's really impressive. And I think that Corey, as you said, should be MVP next year.
Yeah. And also, I mean, Washington was awful last season. Same with the Shock. The Shock were not good in the first season. Sinatra basically leads them to this promised land.
Right.
And Corey has the potential to do the same thing. I think they're just going to win 4 or 5 more games. But if they end up a 16-17 win team and they explode onto the scene, that's another big narrative push where Corey, coming off this big World Cup, you know, leads his team that was the laughing stock of the league last year to
my favorite team,
to a playoff berth. That's big.
Right.
And that's my case for Corey being MVP.
I think they have the San Francisco Shock, the anime arc that the San Francisco Shock had this year. I think Washington Justice will have this next year. Because the losing streak that Shanghai, like that kind of arc, is going to be this, like, triumphant, scrappy kind of go-get-em team.
Yeah.
Dragged along by Corey.
An MVP is never about the best player in the league. It has never been in any sport, you know.
Otherwise, Prophet would win every season.
No, but, like, even last year, like...
No, I know.
Moth, I believe, is... Moth or Choi. No, not Choi, because Choi wasn't that great all season. But Moth, I believe Moth was the MVP of the San Francisco Shock.
Oh, hell yeah.
But Sinatra had the storyline behind him. Prophet was an MVP candidate. Jonak was an MVP candidate. But voter fatigue. You know, like, the best player doesn't always win MVP.
Yeah.
It's also a combination of narrative. So, Corey got the narrative behind him. And hopefully...
He gets it.
Yeah. But them winning MVP is contingent on them overperforming how I think they're going to do.
Yeah.
I think they're like 13, 14 wins. But that's still good. That's like a 12th, 11th seed in the playoffs. That would have been last year. You know, a couple wins breaking their way. But they should be a lot better. They don't have Giannis driving their team down.
Yeah, and I feel like Washington Justice will come in this season as, like, more of a fan favorite.
Yeah. But if they start off rough, it's going to be bad.
Yeah.
Like, if they start off like 0-3 is when you start to panic.
Yeah, and I think Washington was one of the first teams to come out and be like, we got a bunch of, like, games.
They have,
like,
I think they got, like, I don't want to say 6 homestands, but they got, like, a gang of homestands.
Yeah.
Yeah, they got an absurd amount for a team that...
They need to be good. If they're not good, those
bad.
homestands are going to be whack.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Washington has a lot of pressure on them to perform because, you know, we're going to be seeing a lot of games in DC.
That's true.
And I don't know how that might go if they're 0-10 to start the season and fans are like, why the fuck am I gonna go watch Washington lose?
Yeah.
Why am I gonna go watch them lose?
For sure.